Right, let us begin. Question 1, Rachel Musk.
Thank you. Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow I will open the Global Vaccine Summit. The UK-hosted virtual event will bring together more than 50 countries as well as leaders of private sector organisations and civil society to raise at least $7.4 billion for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And tomorrow's Global Vaccine Summit should be the moment when the world comes together to unite humanity in the fight against disease. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Rachel Musk.
As the Prime Minister obfuscates over his adviser, the real scandal of the coronavirus pandemic has been exposed in the Public Health England report published yesterday. Inequality and poverty. If you are black or Asian, if you are poor, if you have a low-skill job, the mortality risk is up to double that of the rest of the population, the poorest having the greatest exposure, risk and fate. And now the government is seriously increasing that exposure and risk with its easement announcements. Why won't the Prime Minister publish a full health and economic risk assessment for public scrutiny to protect us all from this deadly virus?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable lady for her question. And this government commissioned the review from Public Health England, and we take its findings very seriously because there obviously are inequalities in the way that the virus impacts on different people, different communities in our country. And my right honourable friend, the Minister for Equalities, the member for Saffron Waldron, will be looking at what next practical steps we need to do to protect all our country from coronavirus.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past few weeks, Blackpool has been inundated with visitors, and the images of people not social distancing and leaving our beach strewn with litter have angered my constituents at a time when they are doing the right thing and following the government's advice. The fact that Blackpool has one of the highest local infection rates in the nation has only served to heighten these fears. What assistance is the government providing to areas such as Blackpool to deal with the influx of visitors at a time when local services are already under pressure?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he well represents Blackpool, his constituents, sticking up for the interests of Blackpool. In addition to the £3.2 billion we're already given to local councils to help combat corona, Blackpool is receiving another £9 million in particular, as well as the funding from the High Street Fund and the Town Fund to deal with the particular problems that he rightly identifies.
Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by expressing shock and anger at the death of George Floyd? This has shone a light on racism and hatred experienced by many in the US and beyond. I'm surprised the Prime Minister hasn't said anything about this yet, but I do hope that next time he speaks to President Trump, he will convey to him the UK's abhorrence about his response to the events. Mr. Speaker, the Telegraph this morning is reporting that the Prime Minister has decided to take direct control of the government's response to the virus. So an obvious question for the Prime Minister: who's been in direct control up till now?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me begin by associating myself absolutely with what the right honourable gentleman had to say about the death of George Floyd. And I think what happened in the United States was appalling. It was inexcusable. We all saw it on our screens. And I perfectly understand people's right to protest what took place, though obviously I also believe that protests should take place in a lawful and reasonable way. On his more polemical point, let me just say that this government is, I take full responsibility for everything this government has been doing in tackling coronavirus, and I'm very proud of our record. And if you look at what we have achieved so far, it is very considerable. We have protected the NHS. We have driven down the death rate. We are now seeing far fewer hospital admissions, and I believe that the public understand that with good British common sense we will continue to defeat this virus and take this country forward. And what I think the country would like to hear from him is more signs of cooperation in that endeavour.
Mr. Speaker, he asked for a sign of cooperation, a fair challenge. I wrote to him, as he knows, in confidence 2 weeks ago, to ask if I could help build the consensus for getting children back into our schools. I did it confidentially and privately because I didn't want to make a lot of it. He hasn't replied. Mr. Speaker, this is a critical week in our response to COVID-19. Whereas lockdown and stay at home were relatively easy messages, easing restrictions involves very difficult judgment calls. So this is the week of all weeks where public trust and confidence in the government needed to be at its highest. But as the director of the Reuters Institute, which commissioned a YouGov poll this weekend, said, I have never, in 10 years of research, seen a drop in trust like we've seen for the UK government. How worried is the Prime Minister about this loss of trust?
Prime Minister.
I'm surprised he should take that tone, Mr. Speaker, since I took the trouble to ring him up, and we had a long conversation in which I briefed the right honourable gentleman about all the steps that we were taking. He didn't offer any dissent at that stage, I may say, Mr. Speaker. He thoroughly endorsed our approach, and I believe that he should continue to endorse it today. I think that he's on better ground and firmer ground when he stands with the overwhelming majority of the British people who understand the very, very difficult circumstances that we are in and who want clarity across the political spectrum, but who believe that we can move forward, provided we continue to observe the basic rules on social distancing, on washing our hands, and on making sure that when we have symptoms, we take a test and we isolate. And I think everybody understands that. That's why the incidence of this disease is coming down. And I think his attempts to distract the public from that have not been successful, because they continue to pay attention to our guidance.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister challenges me on the offer I made to him. This was a confidential letter. I think the best thing I can do is put it in the public domain, and the public can decide for themselves how constructive we're being. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago today at the dispatch box, the Prime Minister promised that we will have a test, track and trace operation that will be world-beating. And yes, it will be in place by the 1st of June. But it isn't. And a critical element, the ability of local authorities to respond to local spikes, is missing. As one council leader put it to us, we're weeks away from having this fully up and running. We simply weren't given enough warning. The Prime Minister mutters it's not true. Dido Harding, the Prime Minister's own chair of the track and trace system, has said that this element will not be ready until the end of June. The Prime Minister must have been briefed on this problem before he made that promise 2 weeks ago. So why did he make that promise?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he's casting aspersions on the efforts of tens of thousands of people who have set up a test, track and trace system in this country from a standing start. We now have 40,000 people engaged in this. Every person, thousands of people are being tested, as he knows, every day. Every person who tests positive in this country in the track and trace system is contacted. Then thousands of their contacts are themselves contacted, people they've been in contact with. And I can tell the House, at the moment, as a result of our test, track and trace system, which was up and running on the 1st of June, as I said, Mr. Speaker, contrary to what he said, which was up and running, as a result of their efforts, thousands of people are now following our guidance, following the law, and self-isolating to stop the spread of the disease.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome that news from the Prime Minister. He didn't put a number on those that have been traced. But as he knows, the number of people testing positive for COVID-19 every day is only a fraction of those actually infected every day. According to the ONS, the number actually infected every day is between 7,000 and 9,000. Assuming up to 5 contacts need to be traced for every infected person, the system probably needs to reach 45,000 people a day. So there's a long way to go. And I'm sure if it is 45,000 a day, the Prime Minister will confirm that in just a minute. But the problem when the Prime Minister used statistics is that the Statistics Authority have had concerns on more than one occasion. Yesterday, in a strongly worded letter to the Health Secretary, the chair of the UK Statistics Authority said that the statistics still fall well short of expectations. He went on to say, "It is not surprising that, given their inadequacy, data on testing are so widely criticised and so often mistrusted." Can the Prime Minister see how damaging this is to public trust and confidence in his government?
I must say to the Honourable Gentleman, I really do not see the purpose of his endless attacks on public trust and confidence, when what we are trying to do, and I think what the public want to hear from politicians across all parties, are clear messages about how to defeat this virus. Test and trace is a vital tool in our armoury, and contrary to what he says, actually, we did, by the end of May, get up to 100,000 tests a day, and we got up to 200,000 by the beginning of this month. And that was an astonishing achievement, not by government, but by tens of thousands of people working to support government. And I think he should pay tribute to them and what they've achieved.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is confusing scrutiny for attacks. I have supported the government openly, and I've taken criticism for it, but boy, he makes it difficult to support this government over the last 2 weeks. Mr. Speaker, another critical issue on trust and confidence is transparency about decision-making. On the 10th of May, the Prime Minister said, on the question of lifting restrictions, if the alert level won't allow it, we will simply wait and go on until we've got it right. At the time when he said that, the alert level was 4, and the R rate was between 0.5 and 0.9. We're now 3 weeks on. Some restrictions have been lifted. So can the Prime Minister tell us what's the alert level now and what's the R rate now?
Prime Minister.
He knows perfectly well that the alert level does allow it, and indeed he didn't raise that issue with me when we had a conversation on the telephone, and he knows the reason we've been able to make the progress that we have is that the 5 tests have been fulfilled. So, yes, the alert level remains at 4, but as Sage will confirm, we've managed to protect the NHS. We've got the rate of deaths down. We've got the rate of infection down. The PPE crisis, the difficulties in care homes, the question of the R, they have been addressed. And I think the question for him, Mr. Speaker, is whether he actually supports the progress we're making. Because at the weekend he was backing it. Now he's doing a U-turn. Now he seems to be against the steps that this country is taking.
Keir Starmer.
I've supported the government in the gradual easing of restrictions. That is why I wrote to the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago, because I could see the problem with schools, and I thought it needed leadership and consensus, and I privately offered to do what I could to build that consensus. That's the offer that wasn't taken up. Mr. Speaker, can I finally turn to the question of Parliament? Mr. Speaker, I know you feel very strongly about this. The scenes yesterday of MPs queuing to vote and members being unable to vote were frankly shameful. This should not be a political issue. Members on all sides know that this is completely unnecessary and unacceptable. If any other employer behaved like this, it would be a clear and obvious case of indirect discrimination under the Equalities Act. A clear and obvious case. So can I urge the Prime Minister to stop this and to continue to allow online voting and the hybrid Parliament to resume?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do think that the Right Honourable Gentleman needs to consider what is really going on throughout the country, where ordinary people are getting used to queuing for long periods of time to do their shopping or whatever it happens to be. I must say I do not think it unreasonable that we should ask parliamentarians to come back to this place and do their job for the people of this country. And I know it's difficult. I know it's difficult. I apologise. I apologise to colleagues for the inconvenience, and I apologise to all those who have particular difficulties because they are shielded or because they are elderly. And it's vital that they should. And the change we're making today is that they should be able to vote by proxy. They should be able to vote by proxy. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, when the people of this country look at what we are doing, asking schools, he now says he supports schools to go back. I mean, our policy is test, trace and isolate. His policy is agree, U-turn and then criticise, Mr. Speaker. But what I can tell him is that I do think the people of this country, on the whole, will want their parliamentarians to be back at work, doing their job, passing legislation on behalf of the people of this country. And that is what this government intends to do.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Watching events unfold across America in recent days and the actions and rhetoric from the American President have been distressing and deeply worrying. We cannot delude ourselves at believing that we are witnessing anything short of a dangerous slide into autocracy. It is in times like these when people look to those they elect for hope, for guidance, for leadership and for action. However, in the 7 days since George Floyd was murdered, the UK Government has not even offered words. It has not expressed that pain. It has shuttered itself in the hope that no one would notice. The Prime Minister skirted over this earlier in Prime Minister's questions. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what representations has he made to his ally Donald Trump? And at the very least, Prime Minister, say it now, Black Lives Matter.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course Black Lives Matter, and I totally understand the anger, the grief that is felt not just in America but around the world and in our country as well. I totally understand that and I get that. And I also support, as I've said, the right to protest. The only point I would make to the House is that protests should be carried out lawfully, and in this country protests should be carried out in accordance with our rules on social distancing.
Ian Blackford.
Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister didn't answer the question what representations has he made to his friend Donald Trump. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the UK is vocal on human rights, freedom to gather and protest, freedom of speech and upholding press freedom in other parts of the world. It would be nothing short of hypocrisy if we were to turn a blind eye to events unfolding in the US. However, actions speak louder than words, and the Prime Minister can shake his head, but the UK exports millions of pounds worth of riot control equipment to the US, including tear gas and rubber bullets. The Prime Minister must have seen how these weapons are used on American streets. With the government's own guidance warning against equipment being used in such way, will the Prime Minister urgently review such exports?
Minister.
I'm happy to look into any complaints, but as he knows, all exports are conducted in accordance with the consolidated guidance, and the UK is possibly the most scrupulous country in that respect in the world.
Lord Russell-Moyle.
Our firefighters have been assisting this COVID crisis. They've taken 12 additional areas of work supporting our NHS. And while they are busier than ever, they are about to face another round of devastating cuts. My local fire authority in East Sussex is planning to remove 10 fire trucks from the county and the loss of frontline firefighters. Is the Prime Minister planning to respond to the FBU, the Fire Brigade Union letter, sent to him on the 22nd of May, calling for a moratorium on cuts? Clapping on Thursdays is well and good, but will he put his money where his mouth is and ensure that no fire authority needs to cut frontline firefighters when they have been helping save our country?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will certainly respond to his letter.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Community Secretary has admitted unlawfully overruling his own planning inspector to allow the West Surrey development to go ahead, potentially saving the developer, Richard Desmond, who is a Conservative Party donor, £40 million in tax. He did this just weeks after sitting next to the developer at a Tory fundraising dinner. Given that this was the same scheme that the Prime Minister tried to push through when he was Mayor of London, that reappeared after he entered Downing Street, will he now tell the House what conversations he has had with the Secretary of State about the scheme, and will he publish all relevant correspondence between Number 10 and the departments?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to tell the honourable lady that I've had no conversations on that matter whatever, nor any exchanges of any kind.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The lockdown has seen a rise in antisocial behaviour in my area, including at Lullingstone Castle, where a man sadly died last Thursday evening. My sincere condolences are with his family and friends at this time. This incident shows the need for more visible police in Sevenoaks. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the 147 new police officers promised to Kent will not be delayed, and they will be focused on front-line policing to tackle antisocial behaviour?
Prime Minister, will that be...
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why this government is going to get on with its agenda of uniting and levelling up. The 20,000 more police officers. In fact, we've recruited thousands already, and I'm pleased to say that the 147 that she identifies coming to Kent, if they haven't actually already got there, I think they've already got there, but if they haven't got there, they're getting there very shortly.
Ben Bradshaw.
The Public Health Minister told me in an email on May the 22nd that the justification for a 14-day quarantine is, and I quote, where local COVID incidence and prevalence is much lower relative to international incidence and prevalence. It's not, is it? So why is he inflicting, from Monday, a blanket quarantine with no basis in science that will devastate our travel industry and rob British families of their foreign holidays?
I'm surprised to hear that criticism from the Labour benches. I thought that the opposition was in favour of looking at the quarantine policy, but the simple reason is to protect, the answer is to protect the British people from the re-importing of that disease once we have driven infection rates down.
Flora Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that the Prime Minister will join me in standing together not only at grief at the killing of George Floyd, but also determination that we will work together against racism, both in the US and here in the UK. In Putney, black teachers have told me they're scared of going back to school because of the higher rates of death. And also today's figures from the Metropolitan Police show that more than a quarter of lockdown fines have been for black people, although they are an eighth of our London population. Will the Prime Minister condemn the actions of the American police? Will he freeze the sales of tear gas and rubber bullets? Will he review the lockdown fines? And will he act on the report into COVID deaths so that there aren't more black people dying than white?
Sorry, we're not going to get other people in. We've got to be fair to each other. Prime Minister.
Okay, well, she raises a very important series of points. I certainly condemn the killing of George Floyd, and we will certainly make sure that everything that we export to any country around the world is in accordance with the consolidated guidance on human rights.
Laura Farris.
This government has taken the lead on tackling domestic abuse, but there is an ugly dimension that remains unresolved, where men who kill their partners in appalling acts of sexual violence establish in court that she asked for it and avoid a murder conviction. Does my right honourable friend agree that the time is now to end the rough sex defence?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Yeah, she raises, I thank my honourable friend, she raises an incredibly important point, and we are committed to ensuring that the law is made clear on this point, and that defence is inexcusable.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has rightly been focusing on keeping people safe, but that task goes beyond COVID-19. So can my right honourable friend give me the reassurance that as from the 1st of January 2021, the UK will have access to the quantity and quality of data it currently has through PRUM, passenger name records, ECRIS and SIS2, none of which, I believe, should require the ECJ jurisdiction in the UK?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that depends, I'm afraid, on the outcome of our negotiations, as she knows well, but I'm absolutely confident that our friends and partners will see sense and the great mutual benefit in continuing to collaborate in exactly the way that we do.
We now come to the end. In order to allow safe exit, honourable members participating in the item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 5 minutes.